Hey guys, I wanted to create some content around how you should think about the view in a HTML page. Um, I saw some content a couple weeks back uh, showing someone who was building out a page, and it basically was like a cart experience. So I spent some time building out a cart, and so before we get into it, I'll just show you some basic examples. So here we've got all of the products that we can add to the cart, and then the cart itself. So here, if I wanted to, I could say like, I want to add 3 eggs, and there we go. I added a quantity of 3. And you can see here that there's a subtotal, tax total, and a grand total. Um, One of the interesting things here is, and for those of you that are new to programming, this is one of the reasons why uh, you use abstractions like a model, a view, and a controller. So, for example, if I wanted to, I could click here and go and say that uh, instead of 897, now this is going to be 197. And so now if I click on add to cart again, you can see that the calculation here is being included. And the reason why is because we're actually reading the information that exists in the HTML to determine the actual value that we should render to the screen. And so typically this is not something that you should do. So now I'll go ahead and go through some of this code. Effectively, we've got some HTML page. This is not a lesson on styling, so please excuse the laziness on styling. I just wanted to build something quickly so that I could help showcase the issues within JavaScript. So we have the first thing, this is a line item template. In the line item template, that's just basically one of these rows. We've got a subtotal, taxes total, grand total, and those are the values down here. And we've got a document.add event listener for the submit event. And here we're saying, okay, if the submit event was triggered on a target of a HTML form element, meaning any one of these guys, this is what we want to do. So first of all, we want to serialize the data using form data, and then object from entries will go ahead and serialize it. So just so that you can kind of see what's happening here, this is what's happening. So effectively, when we use form data, we can do from entries form data to serialize all of the information of the form into an object that's nice to use. One thing to note here is when you're using from entries, if you have multiple entries in form data, say like for example, you've got a list of checkboxes, and those checkboxes are becoming array values. Those array values are going to be thrown away, and whichever one was the last value will exist in the form data object. So just be mindful of that, be careful. Anyway, so the next thing we do is we're cloning a template. So that list item template, just so that you can kind of see what's going on there, is this line item. So there's a template tag in HTML that allows you to sort of clone pre-existing layouts. So here we've defined our markup that we want to exist in this page, and I've created I've defined an ID on it called line item, and so that's how we can reference it in JavaScript. So with that line item template, we're then getting the total amount of rows. The reason why we need that is so that we can then determine which number it is within the cart. And then here we have cells, and cells is going to be all of the different columns in the table, right? So cell 0 is going to be that row length. We want row length to not be 0, so we increment it by 1. And then basically we're just going ahead and placing the data that we got from our form into the text content of each cell. Now here's one interesting thing. There's something that exists in the browser called INTL. It's a library for doing internationalization, and one of them being number formatting. So with number formatting, all we have to do is pass in a locale. In this case, I'm using ENUS, and for this number format, the style that we want is currency, and the currency format that we want is USD. So in doing that, we can then pass a value that is either a number or a string that can be coerced to a number. In this case, that's what we're doing. Doing that, basically, this is going to format our numbers appropriately without having to do any custom code. So this is something that exists in the browser. Anyway, just for the sake of time, in terms of calculating tax, I'm just randomly assigning a value here. And then, yeah, we have the total. And at the very end of this, we're basically saying, cool, now that we've created our line item, we can go ahead and append that line item. So, we can append the line item to the t-body, which is like the root element here. And then, of course, we need to update the subtotal, the taxes total, and the grand total. And if you notice, the way that we're doing that is by using whatever the value currently is in the HTML. So this is definitely not something that you want to do. A much better way now is, for example, I'm going to show you another version of this. So as you can see, when I click add to cart now, it was much easier to maintain a single line item here. So here, if I say 1 or 4, I can add that 4, and it only creates that single line item, which is kind of nice. Trying to do something like that without maintaining a separate model for the data is going to be a lot harder. Another thing is if I go in here and say now that instead of 995, this is going to be 1095. If I click add, notice that the state of the entire view gets reset and the calculations are still intact. So this is the thing that we're trying to solve for now. So let's take a look at how this is done. At a high level, there are 3 main constructs. We have a cart controller, a products controller, and a checkout controller. So the checkout controller is our root application. And the checkout controller actually contains all of our data, and it also contains a reference to both the cart controller and the products controller. So when we create the checkout controller, one of the things that we do is add an event listener for the submit event. And when that happens, we grab the form data name and quantity, and we forward that off to this function called add to cart. So add to cart needs to communicate with the cart controller, and the cart controller calls add line item. So this just gives you a very clear abstraction around the data flow that needs to happen. Now, before I get into the data flow of each of the sub-controllers, I want to give you a quick peek into the model data. So for the cart model, we have a subtotal, a tax, and a grand total. These are all of the values that are going to be displayed down here, as well as the line items that exist here. So then we have the products model, and in the products model, we basically just have a list of all the different products. Here we've got a title, a name, a tax, and a price. So effectively here the name is going to show up here. The price and the tax and the grand total is completely, the tax, the price, and the tax and the price are going to be completely separate. The name is something that we use to then communicate that, like when we click add to cart here versus add to cart here, that's how we can figure out which product we're talking about currently. So here you can see that name milk exists here, and so when we click add to cart, we can assume that that name is the same name from the product that we're creating. So now let's figure out how we build up this list of products, and by doing that, we basically have a products controller, and we are passing in the model data that we need for this controller. If you're not familiar with the model view controller paradigm, effectively what it means is you have a model, which is your data. You have a view, which is the representation of your data, and you have a view, which is a representation of your data. And that's the thing that is seen by the end user. And then the controller is kind of like the brains of the operation. It tells everything else what it needs, right? It tells the view about how the view should be constructed based off the data, and it tells the model, hey, these are the changes that I need you to make, right? Cool. So now that we understand those concepts, the first thing that happens is we pass in that products model, just like we saw earlier, and we call render. Render is something that's completely arbitrary here, but it's a pretty common practice to call this function render. It's the same across React and several other frameworks. So in render, what happens here is we have this thing called the products view. Now, the products view is literally just a reference to the HTML element that we had earlier, which is the unordered list element called products. And we can go and take a look at what that looks like here. Let me just go up. Here we go. Products. So this is it, and we have a template inside of that products list called product item, and yeah, that's all that exists there. So now going back, we have here we go. So what we're doing is we are saying, hey, for every LI, go ahead and just remove them because we're going to rebuild them from scratch. Now, this is pretty typical for something like jQuery or any of the more like non-frameworky ways to go about rendering HTML. The reason why I'm not doing HTML diffing is because that's exactly what a framework like React is for. So the point of this talk is not necessarily like making this 100% optimal, but more or less just letting you understand kind of what's happening. So typically if you're using React, you wouldn't blow away each list item. You would compare and figure out whether or not the data for the particular view has changed, and if it has, you would update the view if it exists, or you would create a new one in the scenario that you need it, right? So that's like the whole point of why you would use something like React. So that's outside of the scope of this talk. Anyway, so now we have a products model. That products model is an array, and we loop through the array and call this function called render item. And when we render the item, we get a product from the product model. We then create a item view, which is a cloned version of the product template that we saw earlier. And here we're just assigning all of the information from the product to the view. So we have the name value of the input set to product name. We initialize quantity to the value of 1. And then we set the product title for the title of the item view and append the item view to the products view, which is that unordered list. Cool. So now, as soon as I hit refresh, that render function happens. It loops through the entire array, builds up each one of these items, and then when I click add to cart, that submit event fires off inside of the checkouts controller, and at which point we start interacting with the carts controller. So let's go ahead and look at what carts controller does. Here we've got a cart view, a line item template, same sort of deal. The line item template is the thing that builds up the line item. The cart is the actual like table. And here we pass in references from the cart model and the products model and store those references for later use, and then call render. So same sort of deal as what we had in the products controller. So let's go and take a look at render. I'm gonna go ahead and delete this, or maybe we'll keep it for the sake of taking a look at it. Anyway, so here we grab the table rows, every single table row that exists in the table body, and then call remove. This is the same exact thing that we did previously. And then we call render line item, but in this case, because item is going to be an object, we basically just want to render each line item that has a unique name. And so that's what we're doing here. And then render line item, we'll come back to this, or actually let's go ahead and finish it out. So here subtotal and taxes total and grand total are all being rendered by the model data, right? So in the scenario, we have a cart model, and that has a subtotal, a tax, and a grand total. And all of this data is being rendered to the view. The view's not telling the model anything. It's the model that is sort of enhancing the view. Anyway, so now let's go ahead and take a look at render line item. And render line item, here we grab the product by finding its name. There should potentially be a check here, and actually let's just do that real quick. So if there's no product, return. Cool. Wait. If there's no product return. There we go. Cool. So now we grab quantity from the cart model by accessing the item's name. The way that this works, I know it's probably not super straightforward, so let me go ahead and explain that. So in the checkouts controller, we've got this empty object, and the way that this kind of works is literally exactly what Copilot did here. So we just basically keep a running count for all of these items, but rather than having to know about all of the different products in the cart, we start out with this empty object and just store the name at the time that we need to use it. So let's see here, going back here to carts controller. Right. Cool. Boom, boom, boom. Sweet. All right. So we were inside of render line item. We are cloning the line item template and just assigning the content of each field or of each table column for the same exact data. And then we're doing the number formatting, etc. And then at the very end, we append that new item view to the T body or the table body. So cool. Let's go ahead and open up the console log. Let's add some items, and then here we can see that we've got that cart model and the products model and that view from that console log. And you can see here that when we click add to cart a couple times, the cart model basically just has that list of items and the number of counts that are going through. So yeah, hopefully this was helpful. If you guys have any questions, let me know. Happy to answer anything. And if you've got some ideas for other content, that'd be cool too. Yeah, if you like this, go ahead and give me a like and subscribe. See you guys around.